Welcome to the Think Podcast. I'm your host, Cameron Joseph. In today's podcast, I go over the Philosophical Toolkit. The Philosophical Toolkit is a set of fundamental ideas that are necessary to assess arguments in philosophy and will be invaluable to us going forward in our discussions. In the podcast, I discuss what constitutes an argument, the different forms of argumentation, and I end off by discussing how it is that we assess arguments. So without further ado, enjoy the podcast. When most people think of philosophy, they conjure up images of old academics sitting in armchairs, smoking cigars, using funny Latin words such as a priori and ad infinitum. But philosophy is, and always has been, the domain of matters dealing with everyday life. It helps us to answer questions such as, why does evil exist? Do I have free will? What is my purpose in life? And how should we set up the society we live in? But philosophy is also an exercise in thinking. However, thinking about important topics can often be quite challenging, and I personally need a framework within which to organize my thoughts. Otherwise, I just have ideas bouncing around in a sporadic fashion with no end in sight. Luckily, philosophers have provided us with a few tools to help us, and in this podcast I will bolster your mental toolkit by discussing what it is that philosophers do best. Philosophers are in the business of making arguments. However, arguments in a philosophical sense do not denote anger or a quarrel, but rather a way of structuring your thoughts on an issue. I have seen too many people over the years become overly emotional and defensive at the very idea of a debate or an argument. But we are simply trying to get our head around complex ideas and evaluate different approaches to a problem. We are not in any sense devaluing or denigrating someone's experience, quite the opposite in fact. If we decide to philosophically engage with an idea, it means that we already respect the idea enough to take the time and assess it on its merits. So do remember, if a philosopher is presenting an argument to you, don't take it personally. It's got nothing to do with you in particular. The focus is on whether we are dealing with a sound argument. So let's start with the basics. So what is an argument? Arguments in their most basic form are premises that establish a conclusion. The goal of your argument is to show why your conclusion is a sound one to reach. Now, in order to do this, we can utilize different types of arguments. So let's have a quick look at the two main ways of structuring an argument, namely deductive and inductive reasoning. Now, a deductive argument is intended by the thinker to be deductively valid. In a deductive argument, the premises are ordered in a fashion so that if the premises are true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. An inductive argument argues for the likelihood of the conclusion being true if the premises that lead to that conclusion are also true. Inductive arguments are a matter of degree. They ask, how probable is it that the conclusion is true? Unlike a deductive argument, which makes the conclusion undeniably true if the premises logically lead to it. The distinction between the two can be very tricky to understand at first, so here are two examples to illustrate the difference between the two. Let's start with a deductive example. I'm in a park, and there I see a dog, so here comes the argument. I am a person who is going to walk past that dog. Premise 2. Dogs in this world cannot bite people. Conclusion. Therefore, that dog will not bite me when I walk past it. Now let's turn to the inductive form of the same argument. I am a person who is going to walk past that dog. Premise 2. The dog has not bitten anyone before. Conclusion. Therefore, the dog won't try to bite me when I walk past it. Now, as you can see, both arguments arrive at what seems to be similar conclusions. However, in the first argument, it is logically impossible for the dog to bite me, because the argument is deductively valid. there is no possible world in which dogs cannot bite people, but that I also get bitten when walking past the dog. Those two premises cannot coexist in any world, and so therefore it is literally impossible in the world we have sketched for the dog to bite me. But in the second argument, the likelihood that the dog will bite me is highly unlikely, given the evidence. But it's not impossible. We can only say that all evidence thus far suggests that the dog will not bite me. So what we can see is that an inductive argument strength is a matter of degree, in comparison to a deductive one whose strength is more absolute. Now, most of us use inductive reasoning in our everyday lives. In fact, the judicial system, series such as NCIS, CSI, and Sherlock Holmes are all based on using inductive reasoning to reach conclusions. But in the philosophical world, we tend to prefer deductive arguments, due to their relative strength and logical certainty. Now that we have dealt with the two main forms of argument, we can move on to how we actually assess these arguments. The question we want to know is, what makes a good argument? Now, in the philosophy world, an argument is judged to be a good one when it is both valid and sound. Let's deal with those terms one at a time and see what they mean. The definition of valid, in a philosophical sense, means that the premises lead to the conclusion. In other words, the conclusion logically follows from the premises provided. So let's take the following example of a valid argument. Ali is either a cat or a dog. Ali is not a dog, therefore Ali is a cat. Now if we break that down, we can see that the argument took the structure as follows. P or Q. Not Q, therefore P. An important point to note is that an argument can be valid but not actually be true. So let's take the following example to see how this works. Premise 1. If the moon is made of blue cheese, then cows jump over it. Premise 2. The moon is made of blue cheese. Conclusion, therefore cows jump over it. This argument took the form of if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now, as crazy as it is to believe, that is actually a valid argument. There is nothing wrong with the structure of the argument. However, it's not actually true. So as you can see, validity is not concerned with how true the argument actually is in the real world. A valid argument is dependent on whether the premises follow to the conclusion in a logical manner, so that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. But we, being rational human beings, would not consider the previous argument to be a good one, and it's easy to see why. The argument is valid, yes, but it leads to an answer which is obviously false. This is why, when making a good argument, it also has to be sound. So what does sound actually mean? In philosophy, a sound argument is one which is valid and has premises that are actually true, so that the conclusion we reach is true as well. In other words, all sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are sound. So here is an example of a sound argument. If Cameron is not here, then he is somewhere else. Cameron is not here, therefore Cameron is somewhere else. We can see that this argument is clearly valid because the structure runs as follows. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. But note that because the premises are also actually true in the real world, it has the additional quality of being sound, making this a good argument overall. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. In a few minutes you have learned how to argue like a true philosopher. And now that we know how to make good arguments, we are ready to venture out into the world of philosophy, well equipped to evaluate any problem that comes our way.